you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America, a podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 19 of the Forge of Freedom. Today we're going to be talking about a firearms-related topic: what should you know as a new gun owner? And to discuss this topic, I have Mike Ooley back in the studio. You may recall, if you've seen the previous episodes, that Mike was on the show in episode 16 to discuss the NRA annual meeting that was in Indianapolis recently. But for those of you who don't know, Mike is my father, and like me, or maybe I should say like him, we're both attorneys, and we're both firearms instructors. So going to get into the firearms-related topic today. So Mike, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Alex. Appreciate it. Look forward to the discussion.
So we're going to talk about what new gun owners should know with respect to quite a few topics, and we're going to hit some highlights here. We'll get into a little bit more depth on some of these topics maybe in future episodes. But we actually just taught a basic handgun course yesterday, as a matter of fact, didn't we?
We did indeed. Spent all day at the range yesterday. It's always it's a long day, but it's rewarding because we spend time with a few students that get to advance their skills and learn about firearms. And hopefully, one of the reasons we do that is to support the Second Amendment and get as many people out there acting responsibly as we can in support of our Second Amendment and the rights that it recognizes.
Yeah, and the class that we normally teach is the NRA Basic Handgun course. So we work, and we've been teaching that class for quite a few years now. I don't know the exact number of years, but we've been teaching that class for quite a few years, and we deal a lot of times with brand new shooters, and we get a lot of questions about the topics we're going to be discussing today, and so we wanted to give people a resource to look to, maybe if they haven't had any training or if they're looking for training. So let's go ahead and jump in. First of all, we've got several things here to discuss. I guess first of all, I'll ask, if a new gun owner, either they don't have a gun or they're looking for a gun and they have little or no experience, where should they start, Mike?
Well, first of all, I want to just kind of, in my own mind anyway, clarify something. And I think what our audience is for this discussion is what I consider to be the novice gun owner. And even if you're not a novice gun owner out there listening, I'm sure you know someone it is. So this is the person that has virtually no experience with a firearm, has not had any training with a firearm, and they're a lot of times getting into firearms late in life. So that's kind of the target audience that that our training is geared towards, and I think what this podcast is about. And as far as where to start, that's a difficult question, because one of the things that I notice is sometimes people start in places and get advice from sources that probably aren't the best sources to get advice from. So what we encourage people to do is get some sort of training. Of course, we're teaching NRA courses. Maybe you can find an NRA course near you. I would also encourage you to do some due diligence with respect to your firearms training and who you're getting your training from, and ask that person where they have trained. Have they trained at other places with other instructors that are clearly and basically without question credentialed to teach? For instance, have they been to Gunsite? Have they taken a class from Massad Ayoob? Have they taken a class from Tom Givens or John Farnam or Lee Weems, or just a plethora of folks out there? So make sure you do your due diligence and get into a training class of some sort. That's my number one recommendation.
And you mentioned quite a few names there about with respect to reputable trainers. I'll try to link to some of those resources in the show notes, because a lot of those folks have websites or online materials that may be good to look to advance your training. But obviously, we're here in southern Indiana, and Indiana doesn't have a training requirement to possess or carry a firearm. Some states do have a training requirement, but what are your thoughts about the training that a lot of these mandatory training classes that some states have?
Well, I think as you already know, we do not, and I'll speak for you, I think you've been pretty clear about this, we do not support any sort of training requirement. The requirement to take training or pay a fee to exercise a constitutional right is simply inappropriate, actually more than inappropriate. It's wrong in our estimation. So although we do absolutely think that part of being an accountable and responsible gun owner is to seek out competent training, state-mandated training, in my estimation, is inappropriate.
Yeah, and we're being in southern Indiana, we are close to Kentucky, which historically has had a training requirement. And one thing that we've noticed is that folks that live in a state that has a training requirement a lot of times will go to whatever that state-mandated training requirement is, pass that class, and then think they're good. Hey, I know what I've been blessed by the state. I'm good to go. That's as far as my training's going to go. Yeah. And they strap on a handgun and don't get any other training and frankly, probably engage in very little practice beyond that mandatory training. But that's not where it should end, right?
No, it shouldn't. And by the way, I mean, there's some of these mandatory training classes, or I don't mean to diminish all of them. There are probably some of them you'll get something out of them, but it does create, I think, a misnomer that somehow folks are competent to responsibly carry a firearm in public. And the other, it's kind of interesting. We've even had people think that because in Indiana they received a permit from the state, that must mean that they have adequate skills to carry a firearm or to exercise that right, which is sort of bizarre to me. But anyway, some people have indicated that previously.
So we've talked a little bit about training. Make sure you seek out some sort of training course. The NRA has lots of options. USCCA has options. And once you get those basic training courses, seek out further training opportunities because the skill is a perishable skill and you can lose it. So it's something that you want to be able to perform in that life or death situation if you're using a firearm for self-defense, but it's also something that you need to maintain over time.
Yeah, and I think it's a good once again, I think we need to gear our discussion today to the novices, and it might be a good idea to talk about maybe some of the pointers we have that might help people take some first steps with regard to the exercise of carrying a firearm. Yeah,
so I guess with that in mind, where would you start?
Well, I think one, and a lot of people get hung up on this, and I don't think equipment is as important as the training and the practice and developing the skills, but that's the first place most people start is the selection of a firearm, and I do think that's important. I think one thing that I would point out is that a lot of our students anyway, or at least some of our students, the first handgun they buy is a small, almost I'll call them pocket pistols, or they'll even buy a J-frame revolver. And if you're not familiar with what that is, that's just a very small revolver. And there's nothing wrong with those firearms at all, except they're more difficult to operate. They're a little bit more, I hate to use this term, but they're a little bit more of an expert sort of gun. And then the novice walks out of the gun shop with that firearm and begins their journey of improving their skills. And it's very difficult to start with that sort of firearm. I think folks ought to start with what we would consider a full-size service pistol or revolver, which means in my mind probably something that's got at least a 4-inch barrel on it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who take our classes are surprised to learn when they come to the class that the smaller guns are actually much more difficult to shoot than the larger guns, simply because physics is working against you, both with the length of the barrel and the distance between the sights and the weight of the gun. So I think a lot of times people purchase a firearm and then come to our class and figure out, dang, I think I got the wrong gun. I need to go buy something different. So what do you think about that question, Mike? Should people take a class before they buy a gun, or should they buy a gun and then go to the class. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first with regard to your comment there, maybe I bought the wrong gun, I need to go buy another gun. Sometimes the person is just looking past the fact that they've got to put the work in, and it's not the gun. But your question alludes to, I think you know what my response is going to be. I think it's a good idea to take a class before you buy a firearm. And certainly, I also would encourage folks to go to a range where you can rent guns. Probably the best thing to do is to narrow your hunt for a gun down. You can read stuff on the internet, gun reviews, things like that, talk to other knowledgeable folks, but narrow it down to 4 or 5 guns. Go shoot those, take a training course, and then make a final decision on the gun that you're gonna purchase. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. But once again, I would encourage people to start out with that full-size firearm, and I said 4-inch barrel before, and that's probably a good spot. But there are some probably 3.5-inch, guns with 3.5-inch barrels that might be okay. But start with a larger handgun because they're much, much easier to shoot.
Okay, so
for the most part, that's a general statement.
If somebody listening to this says, "Okay, I'm going to take a class, and then I'm going to select a firearm later," what should they look for when they're buying a firearm? I know you've talked about the barrel length. What else should they be looking at in terms of selecting the firearm? Well,
number one is going to be the purpose of the firearm. I'm sort of assuming for our discussions here that at least most of the folks we encounter are buying a handgun anyway. They're buying it for self-defense purposes. So they're going to have to identify the purpose for the firearm. If they're buying it to go deer hunting, that's going to be a completely different type of firearm. Or if they're, buying a firearm for competition use, that may be completely different. So they're going to have to identify the purpose, and then they're going to have to think about their lifestyle. Is it going to be a firearm that's simply going to stay in maybe a small safe in their bedroom, or is it going to be something they're going to carry? So they're going to have to really think about how this firearm is going to be integrated into their life and to the extent of that integration. And then beyond that, frankly, there aren't any bad firearms for the most part. All the major manufacturers make good firearms, and to a great extent, it's Ford versus Chevy. They'll have to make some decisions about revolver versus semi-automatic pistol, things like that. But the biggest deal is the purpose and their lifestyle, I think.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about training, a little bit about pistol selection. When they're looking to buy their first firearm, what should they be looking for in terms of caliber, do you think? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and my opinion's just my opinion. Do your own due diligence there. But I think there's a consensus out there that, and there are exceptions to this, but for the most part, you need to have a .380 caliber pistol or firearm. If you don't know what that means, you need to do a little reading and take a class. But that's sort of the minimum, I think. Some people would say that that's not even adequate if you're going to buy a firearm for self-defense. 9mm, of course, is the most prevalent caliber out there, and there are other calibers as well, but probably most people should, unless they're particularly recoil sensitive, should probably settle on a 9mm most of the time.
And I know in our classes, we suggest that people try to, especially if as a beginner with no experience, sometimes new shooters can be recoil sensitive because they're not used to that firearm going off in their hands, which is understandable. So a lot of times we suggest that they start out with a .22 caliber firearm, which is probably not adequate for self-defense. Of course, if that's the only thing that you can use, that may be the best thing. But certainly, I think 380 or 9mm would be better for self-defense. But if you can find a firearm in a .22 caliber that has a comparable equivalent in a 9mm, that's a great way to start out. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I should have thought of that earlier myself, but I think that's a great way to go. And I don't mean to endorse any products, and I'm not, I don't want to get into the Ford versus Chevy, which gun's better, all that sort of thing. But I know Glock makes and their nomenclature is difficult, but they make a Glock Model 44 that is chambered in .22 caliber, that basically has the same dimensions as a Glock 19, which is in 9mm. So you can start out with that Glock 44 if you're kind of recoil sensitive, hadn't been around firearms. It's also a lot cheaper to put a lot of rounds because you're shooting a 22, but you can start off with that. It'll have the same controls as a Glock 19 when you're ready to move to a 9mm, for instance. And I think that's a great way to go. Through our training classes, we've had a lot of 22s over the years and shot lots and lots of rounds through them because a lot of times our students use our firearms. And that particular gun has been a very good performer for us in the 22 caliber arena. Also, we've had some Smith & Wesson compact 22s that have performed well, but we've been real happy with those Glock 44s in terms of their reliability and functioning. At least so far, we've had them for couple years. I don't know, not too long after they came out, but we've had them for a couple of years at least, and they've been working well for us.
And I think maybe we can get into more detail about equipment in future episodes, but I think you're right that our experience with the Glock 44 and the 22 and the Glock 19 and the 9mm has been a good one for students. It seems like a good fit for lots of people to get into the shooting discipline with a 22, a lower recoil firearm, and then advance to the 9mm once they're comfortable. And likewise with the Smith & Wesson, it's been great as well, but the only downside to it is that it's not quite the same form factor. It's not quite the same size and shape. The controls are the same, but the size and shape is a little different than their 9mm. So that's really the only downside there. But there are other examples where manufacturers make a 22 that's similar to their full-size 9mm firearm.
Absolutely. And I would certainly encourage people to look at that. One other thing I'll mention, too, is we deal with some folks that sometimes don't have as much grip strength as a 30-something-year-old male has. But the gun manufacturers in the last, 2 or 3 years have really started to cater to an older demographic. For instance, if you have a hard time racking the slide on a semi-automatic pistol, some of the manufacturers like Smith & Wesson, they have an EZ line. So when you think about firearms and making a purchase, it's not just being able to fire or shoot the firearm. It's also you got to be able to rack the slide. You got to be able to lock the slide back with the slide stop. You've got to be able to get it apart to clean it. There are lots of other things involved in gun handling and marksmanship other than just pointing the gun and pressing the trigger. So make sure you can operate whatever gun that you're really interested in, and by operate I mean more than just shoot.
So, and that brings me back to where we began. We talked a little bit about training. We talked a little bit about equipment. Let's get into the safety aspect of things, because that's really going to be the focus of the first class you take, or it should be anyway. You want to say a little bit about firearm safety and safe gun handling?
Well, number one, and I'll just mention this because we've been stuck on equipment, make sure whatever firearm you choose, make sure you familiarize yourself with that firearm. You shouldn't have, and we run into this, you shouldn't have a firearm that somebody else has to take apart and clean. Make sure you can maintain that firearm, and there are lots of sources out there. Your owner's manual is the number one source, but there are lots of sources out there. So make sure you familiarize yourself with the firearm. Number two, you have to make sure that you internalize the rules of safe gun handling. And there are various iterations of these, whether you go with the NRA rules or you go with the 4 rules of gun safety that they may teach at Gunsite. But the bottom line is that you need to always keep a gun pointed in a safe direction. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot it. You need to keep it unloaded until you're ready to use. And if you're carrying it, you're using it. You need to treat every firearm as if it's loaded, even though you believe and have double-checked that it's unloaded. And then you need to always know your target and what's beyond. Now, I went through those really quickly. Some of them. There are lots of other ancillary safety rules as well. But, when we teach classes, people go to the range. We all know what the safe direction is. We have 3 or 4 range safety officers for just a few people. And it's kind of easy there to know where a safe direction is, for instance. But in the real world, when you carry a firearm, it's not always easy to identify a safe direction. And people really need to make sure that they apply themselves and think about these safety concepts, because the concepts, number one, are not just applicable in a training environment on a range. They're applicable out in the real world, and sometimes it's difficult to have the discipline and to be able to, identify the safe direction and execute that.
Yeah, and in fact, one thing we encourage people to do, because like you say, I think people underestimate the difficulty of applying these simple rules in real-world contexts because they're so situationally dependent. A safe direction is not going to be the same on the range as it is in your house or somewhere else out in the world. So a lot of times what we encourage people to do, right, is to act like you've got a finger pistol, or if you have access to a dummy gun, which is just a plastic inert firearm that simulates a gun, for a week or two or more, if you want, act like you're going to pick up that firearm in your house and keep it pointed in a safe direction. Are you downstairs? Where's the safe direction while you're downstairs? If you're upstairs, where's the safe direction while you're upstairs, etc. So that's one thing that we think helps people sort of internalize these rules, is to actually practice them, but not with a real firearm, at least for a little while.
Absolutely, and it's much more difficult. I encourage people to get the blue gun. We call them blue guns. They can be orange or red or something else, but it's a plastic. It's not a real gun. But try to move around your house and make sure you're pointing that gun in a safe direction, and think about it. Go through that exercise, not with a real gun, not with a loaded gun, but try to go through those things. And I think folks may find it's more difficult than they think that it is. Like you mentioned, if you're on the second floor of your 2-story home, down may not be a safe area versus out on an outdoor range somewhere. Down in the dirt maybe. So it's very situationally dependent. And one thing that I have heard, I want to mention this because I mentioned a while ago, treat all guns as if they're loaded all the time. One of the things you will hear is that people will, for instance, point a gun at their lap, or they'll do something unsafe, and they'll say, what's their response? Oh, it was unloaded. No, we don't treat guns in two different manners. One if we know they're loaded, and another if we think they're unloaded. And the reason that is because at some point we're human, we're going to make a mistake, and a gun that we think is unloaded will be loaded. So that's how we always treat them, as if they are loaded.
Yeah, and that's one of the rules for safe gun handling. And yesterday when we were teaching the class, and in every class we teach, we repeat those rules time and time again so that those rules become ingrained in our students' minds. But it doesn't end at the class. They have to know it, internalize it, and practice it, because again, those are perishable skills. But the other thing is that with respect to internalizing these skills, it's not just the safety, right? I mean, actually practicing the skills, like we talked about earlier, requires repetition. And that's the same with respect to these safety rules.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on physiology or psychology, but it's my understanding it can take 10,000 repetitions of some skills before we actually internalize them. And when we say internalize, what we mean is we're learning skills at what we characterize as an unconscious competence level. And what we mean is by that, like for instance, when you tie your shoes, most people, you don't think about how to tie your shoes like you did when you were in kindergarten learning how to do it. You just do it. And it happens almost subconsciously. And that's the level of skill that we need to have with respect to these safety rules. Like for instance, another one we haven't talked about is keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. It's amazing how many times you go into a gun store or someplace else, and what do folks do? They put that finger right inside the finger or trigger guard when they pick up that firearm. So you've got to be disciplined. You've got to get this skill level to the level of unconscious competence, so that it just happens automatically and you don't think about it. Ultimately, if you're carrying a firearm for self-defense, you might, we hope not, have to use that firearm. And the decision whether to use a firearm or not is a highly complicated decision, and we don't want to have to be using our cognitive skills to think about, the safety rules. We want to make sure those are handled unconsciously in our minds so that we can approach whatever problem we may have that may or may not mean to be solved with a firearm or pepper spray or avoidance skills or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and I think that brings us maybe to the next part of our discussion, obviously we want the rules for safe gun handling to be second nature. We want those to be ingrained in something that we're unconsciously competent at. We want the marksmanship to be second nature. You mentioned tying a shoe. I always like to think of Michael Jordan shooting a jump shot. He's not thinking about where his hand is placed on the ball, how his feet are lined up, how his arms and hands are lined up with the basket, his follow through. He's not thinking about any of that. It's just automatic. He's unconsciously competent at that discipline. And that's the way it has to be with safe gun handling and with marksmanship when you face what we call this critical incident, which is, I think, where I want to go next. And this critical incident is this life or death situation. You're not going to have time to think about all those things consciously. And so I think when people finish our basic handgun course, we would consider them to be mostly consciously competent, not unconsciously competent. And to become unconsciously competent takes much more practice and training so that you can reach that level of skill so that in that critical incident you don't have to think about that. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Mike?
No, I think, like I said, I've probably talked too much today, but we need to be able to have as much mind horsepower, so to speak, to deal with whatever problem we need to solve. And to do that, we need to have these other skills, the safety skills in particular, gun manipulation, things like that. We need to have those as second nature to us so that we don't have to think about them.
Yeah, because in the critical incident, right, we're going to be facing a life or death moment. And in that life or death moment, you're going to have to face, like you said, the problem at hand, and you're not going to be able to think about what you're doing with your grip, your stance, your trigger press, your sight picture, your sight alignment, all those things that you have to perform to get accurate shots on target.
Yeah, if we are faced with a situation where we have to determine whether we must use deadly force to defend ourselves or another innocent person from the threat of deadly force against us, we want as much brain horsepower as we can get to make that decision.
And I think one thing that training does, it's a little bit of a practice in humility as much as it is a practice in actually gun handling and marksmanship, because I think people, and I was in this boat, or in this camp, I think people overestimate their ability to perform under pressure. And when you actually go to training, even if it's just basic handgun training, a lot of people find out they're not as good as they thought they were, and they're not good under pressure. Because as you advance in training, a lot of times we'll put pressure restraints and like time requirements and things like that. There is nobody that's trying to kill you, right? It's just the pressure of a timer a lot of times that makes people lose their abilities. So those sorts of things I think are eye-opening. They provide some humility and some motivation to train some more.
Yeah, I mean, just a timer and other people watching put enormous pressure on folks. And what people need to realize is that we all have room for improvement. There's always somebody better somewhere. So we're not competing against everybody else that I'll borrow a little bit from Bob Knight here. We're not, shows you my age, we're not competing against everybody else that's watching us. We're competing against ourselves to try to make ourselves a little bit better than we were at the beginning of the day. That's what the goal needs to be.
And ultimately, we want to be better than the person that's trying to do us harm.
Yep.
And so you want to make sure that you're at least better than the potential attacker.
Yeah, and fortunately, what we see from real gunfights is the bad guys are not particularly skilled. So that's some good news there.
That's good news, but we should strive to increase our margin for error, I believe.
Absolutely. I guess what I'm trying to say is you don't have to be, a Navy SEAL with an AR to be able to use an AR effectively. So anyway,
or Max Michel or Jerry Michalik with a handgun, who are two of the best shooters in the world with a handgun. Okay, so we've talked about training, we've talked about marksmanship, safe gun handling.
Can I bring something up?
Sure.
If you remember, and if you don't, that's okay. I shouldn't ask, but what's the it's not the literature or the saying or the notion that folks that are competent tend to see themselves as less. Can you address that?
I know what you're talking about. So there is this psychological effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
That's it.
That it basically stands for the notion that people who are not well trained tend to overestimate their ability, and people who are more well trained tend to underestimate their ability. And this applies to lots of areas, not just with respect to firearms training. People who are well educated, for instance, tend to think that they're not as smart as they are, and people who are uneducated tend to believe that they're smarter than they are, for instance. But that's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and we see that all the time with respect to firearms. People who are terrible with safe gun handling and marksmanship believe that they are actually good, and that's why training is so important.
Thank you. I couldn't remember what I was trying to remember.
So we've talked about training, we've talked about safe gun handling and marksmanship a little bit, and we've talked about that critical incident some. You're going to have to be able to perform all those things in that critical incident, but you're also going to have to be able to determine whether or not you're legally justified in using force in that life or death moment. So this is not a simple task to use a firearm in self-defense effectively. And there are lots of layers of skill and knowledge that have to be applied in moments, if not seconds. So you want to say a little bit about the law and what people should know or maybe look for with respect to the law and education in that arena?
Oh, goodness. It's funny, a little story. One of the training courses we've done and would recommend everybody do it is Massad Ayyoob's Mag 40. Well, that course has about 20 hours of instruction on the legal decisions or the legal information. And that's a great course, but it's 20 hours, that portion of it. So it's difficult, and I mention that because it's difficult to distill this all down to just a few minutes. One of the things we do is we teach a 5.5 hour course on what we think are the essential things, just the bare minimum that folks ought to know about the use of a firearm or deadly force. But I guess kind of the rule that I go by is, am I facing an immediate, otherwise unavoidable threat of death or grave bodily harm to me or another innocent person? And I want to give one caveat out there. I don't think we want to get into this here today, but I said, is it avoidable? In some jurisdictions, you don't necessarily have to avoid, and that's what Stand Your Ground is all about, is the elimination of the avoidance requirement. But for me, in basically all 50 states, am I facing an immediate, otherwise unavoidable threat of death or grave bodily harm? And I have to internalize that, and I have to know whether that exists or not. And the other thing I would say about it, and then I'll try to be quiet, is the question is not can I use deadly force, but the question should always be, must I use deadly force in this situation to protect the life of an innocent person, me or someone else?
Yeah, a lot of times people ask us questions in the light of the Castle Doctrine, and I've done an episode on that in a previous show, or Stand Your Ground. But a lot of times they're asking, can I use deadly force? Am I protected by those doctrines if I use deadly force? And that's the wrong question. Really, you should, like you said, must I use deadly force? And are those elements present? Is there an immediate, otherwise unavoidable threat of death or grave bodily harm to me or another innocent person? And that's something that we primarily get from Massad Ayoob, but it also sort of encompasses a lot of the principles that another well-known attorney in the area of self-defense, Andrew Branca, he has a book called The Law of Self-Defense, which is very good, and talks about a lot of the elements that have to be present for the lawful use of force. So you mentioned Massad Ayoob. He teaches a class, Mag 40, which is both a live fire class and a class that teaches the legal elements of the use of force. And he has a book, one of the original books that he wrote, and maybe the original book, I'm not sure, In the Gravest Extreme, which is a great book to start out with as well. Do you have any other resources you think people should look to? I know you mentioned our class, but do you have anything else in mind?
Well, if you're local, take our class. I think it's a great place to start because we've taken Mass's class. We've gone through his deadly force certification, other courses. And, of course, we have some, as lawyers, we have some education there as well. But I think that's a good course. Andrew Branca does a great job. If you can take Massad Ayyoob's courses, that's a great thing to do. But he's written some other books as well. But I won't say it's his first book, but I think it is. It's one of his first books. In the Gravest Extreme is where to start. And then anything else he's written since then, you can get on Amazon or whatever. Any of his books are good. Andrew's books are good. There are lots of things out there that Mass has written. So, and by mentioning these, I don't mean to exclude anybody else. There are probably others, but I know you're safe with those folks.
And like I said earlier, I'll try to link to a lot of the resources that we've mentioned here on the show in the show notes. Mike, I think that's where we're going to leave it for now. I'll let you say just a few last words if you'd like here in a minute. But I think what's important, we've hit a lot of the highlights here. But there's a lot more to a lot of these topics that we've mentioned, whether it's training, equipment, education, the law, any of these sorts of topics. But I think it's important for folks to remember that this is not a responsibility. The right to keep and bear arms is not a responsibility that should be taken lightly. It's a right, but it's also a serious responsibility, and I think people should exercise it responsibly. Do you have any thoughts on that or any closing remarks that you'd like to make before we sign off here? No,
I think you've summed it up well, and I've talked enough today, except I will mention one thing, and that is when you get that firearm, particularly if there's any chance there's going to be an unauthorized person around you, make sure you secure that firearm. I think a good rule of thumb is the firearm is either on you or within arm's length, or it's locked up somewhere. So,
all right. Well, thanks again, Mike, for joining the show. Glad to have you on. I'm sure you'll be on quite a bit in the future. We'll maybe do a deep dive into some of these topics in future episodes. So thanks again for joining.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. As always, if you did enjoy it, don't forget to like it and give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Sunday, I'll be releasing actually another episode. So next Sunday, we're recording this on Sunday, actually. But next Sunday, I'll be releasing another episode about Aristotle's concept of virtue and the good life. Until then, remember, you are the forge of freedom.